Colorado Territory, 1879. Elijah Foster stared at the dirt beneath his boots, still fresh from the morning's rain, as the Reverend's words washed over the small gathering. 6-year-old Samuel clutched his father's hand, his small fingers trembling. 4-year-old Alice buried her face in her father's coat, too young to understand the permanence of what they were witnessing, but old enough to feel the weight of the moment. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the Reverend intoned, his voice carrying across the windswept cemetery on the hill overlooking the Foster ranch. Elijah barely heard the condolences offered by the townsfolk as they departed. His mind still reeled from how quickly typhoid had claimed Margaret. 3 weeks from first fever to final breath. 3 weeks to destroy the life they had built over 8 years of marriage. "Papa," Samuel tugged at his sleeve as the last wagon rolled away. "Who's going to teach us our letters now?" The question pierced Elijah's heart more painfully than he could have imagined. Margaret had been determined their children would be educated, even out here where the nearest proper school was a day's ride away in Silverton. "I don't know, son," he answered truthfully, his voice hoarse. "But I promise you'll learn your letters." It was a promise he had no idea how to keep. Dorothy Campbell stepped down from the stagecoach, her legs stiff from the 3-day journey from Denver. Silverton appeared before her, just as the Colorado Teachers Association had described, a rugged mining town surrounded by towering mountains on all sides, their peaks still capped with snow despite the June warmth. "First time in these parts, miss?" The driver handed down her trunk. "Is it that obvious?" she asked with a small smile, brushing dust from her navy traveling dress. "Most ladies arriving here either have family waiting or are, well, not school teachers," he said tactfully. Dorothy straightened her shoulders. At 24, she had chosen a path that many of her friends in Boston had found puzzling, if not scandalous. But after her father's passing had left her with little but her education, the advertisement for traveling teachers in the Colorado Territory had seemed like providence. "The school board representative is to meet me," she said, glancing around the busy street. "That'd be Mrs. Holloway. She'll be along." The driver tipped his hat before climbing back to his perch. Dorothy surveyed the main street with its wooden boardwalks and false-fronted buildings. Men in dusty clothes moved purposefully between the assay office and the saloon, while women in practical calico dresses carried baskets from the general store. A rotund woman in her 50s approached, her face creased with a welcoming smile. "Miss Campbell? I'm Harriet Holloway. Welcome to Silverton. Thank you for meeting me, Mrs. Holloway. We're mighty pleased you've come. The town proper has its schoolhouse, but it's the outlying ranches and homesteads that suffer for education. That's where you'll be most needed." Dorothy nodded, having understood this would be her primary duty. "I'm eager to begin." "Good, because I've already arranged your first posting. The Foster Ranch, about 12 miles out. They've 2 young ones in need of schooling." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. "Their mama passed this past winter. Elijah Foster's a good man, works harder than most, but those children need learning." Something tightened in Dorothy's chest, sympathy, certainly, but also a flutter of apprehension. She hadn't expected to be sent immediately into a household touched by such recent tragedy. "When do I leave?" "Tomorrow. Mr. Foster will come for you himself." Mrs. Holloway began walking toward a modest boarding house. "You'll stay with me tonight. We can discuss the particulars of your arrangement over supper." As Dorothy followed, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of man this Elijah Foster was, and what awaited her at his ranch among the mountains. Elijah adjusted his only decent shirt for the 3rd time, uncomfortable in the confinement of a collar after months of work clothes. The wagon seat creaked beneath him as he guided his team down Silverton's main street. "Mr. Foster." Mrs. Holloway waved from the porch of her boarding house. Beside her stood a slender woman in a sensible traveling outfit, her chestnut hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. He pulled the wagon to a stop, suddenly aware of his rough hands and the stubble he'd failed to properly address that morning. It had been months since he'd concerned himself with his appearance. "Mrs. Holloway," he greeted with a nod as he climbed down. He turned to the young woman. "Miss Campbell, I presume?" "Yes." She extended her gloved hand, her posture straight as a fence post, but her smile genuine. "Dorothy Campbell. Thank you for coming to collect me, Mr. Foster." Her accent carried traces of somewhere eastern, and her complexion suggested she hadn't spent much time under the western sun. But her grip was surprisingly firm, and her green eyes held a determination he hadn't expected. "The children are looking forward to meeting you," he said, the words feeling awkward on his tongue. Since Margaret's passing, conversation beyond the necessities of ranch work had become a foreign language to him. Mrs. Holloway helped load Dorothy's trunk and a wooden crate of books into the wagon bed. "Remember, Miss Campbell, you'll have 2 weeks at the Foster place, then rotate to the Hendersons." Dorothy nodded. "Yes, the circuit schedule is clear." As he helped her onto the wagon seat, Elijah noticed the way she assessed the distance to the mountains, calculating the journey ahead with a practical eye that surprised him. "It's farther than it looks," he offered. "The clear air fools many newcomers." "I've been warned about the deceptive nature of western distances," she replied with a small smile. "Though I admit, the scale of everything here still startles me." They set off, the town quickly giving way to open country. For the first mile, they rode in silence, Dorothy occasionally glancing at the wildflowers that dotted the roadside. "Your children," she finally said. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned they're 6 and 4? "Samuel's 6, Alice is 4, he confirmed, finding it easier to talk about his children than himself. "Samuel's sharp, started his letters with his mother, but hasn't progressed since." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "And Alice, curious about everything, follows her brother like a shadow." A genuine smile touched his lips for the first time that day. "They're good children. I'm sure they are, Mr. Foster." Her voice was gentle, without the pity he'd grown to resent from others. "Children are resilient, but education gives them structure when other things may be uncertain." The observation was surprisingly astute, and Elijah found himself glancing at her with new interest. "You've taught many children, then?" "In Boston, yes. But this is my first position in the West." She adjusted her hat against the afternoon sun. "I believe knowledge is freedom, Mr. Foster, especially out here where opportunities might seem limited." Margaret, my wife, believed the same. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Dorothy's expression showed empathy without condescension. "Then I hope to honor her wishes for your children's education." The conversation lapsed into silence again, but something had shifted. As they continued toward the mountains, Elijah found himself wondering what other surprises this Eastern schoolteacher might bring to their isolated ranch. Dorothy tried not to stare as the Foster ranch came into view. The main house was sturdier than she'd expected, a 2-story structure built of squared logs with a wide porch across the front. A barn and several outbuildings formed a protective semicircle against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains. "It's lovely," she said honestly. "Built most of it myself," Elijah replied, a hint of pride breaking through his reserve. Margaret wanted a proper home, not just a cabin. As they pulled into the yard, 2 small figures burst from the house, followed by an older woman wiping her hands on an apron. "Papa!" the little girl cried, golden curls bouncing as she ran. Elijah barely had time to set the brake before climbing down to scoop her into his arms. The boy approached more cautiously, his eyes fixed on Dorothy. "Children, this is Miss Campbell. She'll be teaching you for the next 2 weeks, Elijah explained, setting his daughter down. Dorothy smiled, taking note of Samuel's serious expression, so like his father's, and Alice's wide-eyed curiosity. "Hello, Samuel. Hello, Alice," she said warmly. "I'm very pleased to meet you both. Are you going to live here?" Alice asked bluntly. "Just for a little while, yes," Dorothy replied. "I've brought books and slates so we can have lessons together." Samuel's expression remained guarded. "Can you teach about ships? I want to learn about ships." The request surprised her. "I certainly can. Have you ever seen a ship?" He shook his head. "But Mama read me stories about them. She said someday we might see the ocean." Dorothy caught the flash of pain across Elijah's features before he turned away to unload her trunk. The older woman approached, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Frances Miller, housekeeper and cook. Come along. I'll show you to your room." As Dorothy followed Mrs. Miller inside, she glimpsed Elijah kneeling beside Samuel, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. Something about the tender way the rancher placed his hand on his son's shoulder made her heart tighten unexpectedly. The house interior revealed Margaret Foster's influence. Braided rugs softened the plank floors, and simple curtains framed the windows. Family photographs and a few well-worn books spoke of a home built with care and aspiration. "You'll be in here," Mrs. Miller said, opening a door to a small but comfortable bedroom. It was going to be for another child, but she let the sentence hang unfinished. It's perfect, thank you, Dorothy said quickly. Supper's at 6 sharp. The bathroom's down the hall. We've got indoor plumbing, which is more than most out here can say. Mrs. Miller sounded proud of this modern convenience. Mr. Foster added it last year for his wife. She'd been sickly before. Dorothy nodded, understanding the unspoken words. Left alone, she sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. She was a stranger here, stepping into the void left by a beloved wife and mother. The weight of that responsibility settled over her as she unpacked her few belongings. From her window, she could see Elijah in the yard, pointing out something in the distance to his children. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad beneath his work shirt, but even from this distance, she could sense the invisible burden he carried. What had brought her to this place? Not just the teaching position, but something more, a restlessness that had driven her west after her father's death, seeking purpose beyond the limited options available to her in Boston. With a deep breath, she turned to organizing her teaching materials. Whatever her reasons for coming, she was here now, and those children deserved her best efforts. Supper that first evening was a quiet affair. Elijah watched as Dorothy gently encouraged Samuel to discuss what he knew of his letters, and smiled at Alice's enthusiastic, if jumbled, recitation of numbers. You've already taught them well, Dorothy observed as Mrs. Miller cleared the plates. Elijah shook his head. That was all Margaret. I can read and cipher well enough for ranch accounts, but teaching? He trailed off. Papa can build anything, Samuel declared proudly. He made my bed and Alice's cradle and Mama's rocking chair. Dorothy's gaze shifted to the empty chair near the fireplace, its runners worn smooth from use. Your father is very talented, she agreed, tactfully steering the conversation away from painful memories. Tomorrow, perhaps he can show us where we might have our lessons. The dining tables served well enough, Elijah said. Unless you'd prefer somewhere else. This will be perfect. I like to begin with 2 hours in the morning and perhaps an hour after lunch, if that suits your schedule. He nodded. I'll be working the north pasture most days, but within earshot, if needed. After the children were tucked into bed, Dorothy found herself alone with Elijah on the front porch. The evening air carried the scent of pine and distant rain. Mr. Foster, she began carefully, I want to thank you for your hospitality. No need for thanks. You're providing a service we sorely need. His voice was matter of fact, but not unkind. Still, I understand having a stranger in your home isn't easy. She hesitated. If there are any particular subjects or books you'd prefer I avoid. Elijah turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. Miss Campbell, my wife believed education was the greatest gift we could give our children. I won't place restrictions on that gift. The simple statement revealed more about his character than he perhaps intended. Dorothy felt a flutter of admiration for this man who, despite his grief, placed his children's future above his own comfort. Then I'll do my utmost to honor that belief, she promised. A moment of silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant call of a nighthawk. If you'll excuse me, he finally said, I have some accounts to review before turning in. As Dorothy watched him disappear into the house, she couldn't help but wonder about the man behind the carefully maintained reserve. There was a depth to Elijah Foster that intrigued her, a complexity she hadn't expected to find on a remote Colorado ranch. By the end of her first week at the Foster Ranch, Dorothy had established a comfortable rhythm with the children. Samuel, initially wary, had warmed to her after she'd produced a detailed book about sailing vessels. Alice's natural exuberance made her an eager, if easily distracted, pupil. Elijah kept his distance during lessons, but Dorothy occasionally caught him pausing by the open door, listening to his children's recitations with a quiet pride that touched her deeply. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the windows, Dorothy was reading to the children when she noticed Elijah standing in the doorway, his expression softer than she'd yet seen it. Papa, Alice exclaimed, Miss Campbell is teaching us about the stars. Is she now? He stepped into the room, drawn by his daughter's enthusiasm. We're learning constellations, Dorothy explained. I was just telling them how sailors use the stars to navigate. Like a map in the sky, Samuel added importantly. Elijah nodded. My grandfather was a sailor. Used to tell me stories about following the North Star home. Dorothy couldn't hide her surprise. I didn't know you had seafaring ancestors. Pennsylvania Dutch on my mother's side, but my father's people came from Maine. A faint smile crossed his face. That's where Margaret got the notion of seeing the ocean someday. The casual mention of his wife, offered without the usual shadow of pain, felt like a small victory. Perhaps you could show the children the stars tonight, if the rain clears, she suggested. I'd like that, he said, and for a moment, their eyes met in shared understanding. That evening, with the sky washed clean by the afternoon rain, Elijah led them all to a small rise behind the house. The children, wrapped in blankets against the cooling air, sat between Dorothy and Elijah as he pointed out constellations with surprising knowledge. And that's Cassiopeia, he explained, tracing the W shape. The queen who boasted of her beauty. You know quite a lot about the stars, Mr. Foster, Dorothy observed. In the moonlight, she saw his profile soften. Clear nights get lonely when you're watching the herd. Stars make good company. The simple admission revealed a glimpse of the solitude he must have endured these past months. Later, after the children were asleep, Dorothy found herself again on the porch with Elijah. The night was filled with the chorus of crickets and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. They're thriving under your guidance, he said suddenly. Samuel especially. They're bright children, Mr. Foster. You and your wife laid a strong foundation. He nodded, his hands resting on the porch railing. Margaret would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for pretense either. Dorothy smiled at what she recognized as a compliment. May I ask how you met her? For a moment, she feared she'd overstepped, but then Elijah leaned back, his face tilted toward the stars they'd been studying earlier. She was teaching at a one-room schoolhouse near my father's ranch in Wyoming. I was delivering supplies. A genuine smile touched his lips at the memory. She had all those children reciting multiplication tables, and not one of them dared fidget. I was 22 and had never seen anything like her. She sounds remarkable. She was. Too remarkable for Wyoming winters, as it turned out. Her lungs were never strong. That's why we came here, the drier air. He shook his head. Ironic that in the end, it wasn't her lungs that took her. Dorothy hesitated, then asked quietly, Is that why you've been teaching Samuel about ships? Because of her promise about the ocean? Elijah's hands tightened on the railing. Some promises shouldn't die with the person who made them. The raw honesty in his voice stirred something in Dorothy. Admiration, certainly, but also a deeper feeling she wasn't prepared to examine. No, she agreed softly. They shouldn't. The second week passed too quickly. Dorothy found herself lingering over lessons, treasuring Samuel's serious questions and Alice's spontaneous hugs. Even more surprising was how comfortable she'd become in Elijah's presence. Their evening conversations on the porch now an anticipated part of her day. On her final afternoon, Dorothy was helping Alice with simple addition when the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Through the window, she saw Elijah riding hard toward the house, followed by two ranch hands driving a small herd of cattle. Stay inside, she instructed the children, moving to the door as Elijah dismounted. Miss Campbell, he called, his voice urgent. We've got a situation. Mountain lion's been stalking the herd. Travis here got a shot off, but it's wounded and dangerous. The ranch hand beside him nodded grimly. Tracked it to the ridge above the east pasture. I need to go after it before dark, Elijah continued. Mrs. Miller's visiting her sister in town. The children will be fine with me, Dorothy assured him without hesitation. Please be careful. His eyes held hers for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. I'll be back by nightfall. Keep the doors locked. As the men rode away, Dorothy felt a flutter of fear, not for herself, but for Elijah. The thought of him facing a wounded predator turned her blood cold. Where's Papa going? Samuel asked from behind her. She turned with what she hoped was a reassuring smile. He needs to protect the cattle. He'll be back soon. She clapped her hands together. Now, who wants to help me prepare a special supper for when he returns? The cooking project kept the children distracted, though Dorothy found herself glancing repeatedly at the window as the afternoon shadows lengthened into evening. When they'd set the table and still Elijah hadn't returned, she lit the lamps and tried to maintain a cheerful demeanor for the children's sake. Perhaps we should practice your reading while we wait, she suggested to Samuel. They were midway through a story when the sound of approaching horses brought Dorothy to her feet. Through the window, she saw Elijah dismounting slowly, one sleeve of his shirt torn and darkened with what could only be blood. "Stay here," she told the children firmly, hurrying outside. Elijah looked up as she approached, his face drawn with pain and exhaustion. "Got it," he said simply. "But it got me a little too. You're hurt." She reached for him instinctively as he swayed slightly. "Just a scratch," he insisted, though he didn't resist when she slipped under his uninjured arm to support him. In the lamplight of the kitchen, the scratch revealed itself as 3 deep claw marks running from shoulder to elbow. "The children," he began, "are finishing their story," she assured him. "Let me tend to this before they see you." To her surprise, he nodded, allowing her to guide him to his bedroom. There, she carefully helped him remove his torn shirt, her nurse's training from the war hospitals in Boston overriding any impropriety in the situation. "You need stitches," she said after examining the wounds. "Wouldn't be the first time," he replied grimly. "There's a kit in the top drawer there." As Dorothy cleaned and stitched the worst of the gashes, she was struck by the quiet strength with which Elijah endured the pain. His only reaction was the occasional tightening of his jaw and the controlled rhythm of his breathing. "You've done this before," he observed as she tied off the final stitch. "During the war," she explained, wrapping clean bandages around his arm. "I volunteered at the hospital near my father's home. A teacher and a nurse." "You're full of surprises, Miss Campbell." Their eyes met, and Dorothy became acutely aware of their proximity, of her hands against his skin, of the unusual intimacy of the moment. She stepped back, suddenly flustered. "I should check on the children. They'll want to see you're safe." Elijah caught her wrist gently. "Thank you, Dorothy." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "You're welcome, Elijah," she replied softly before slipping from the room. That night, after the children were asleep, Dorothy sat alone on the porch, her thoughts in turmoil. Tomorrow she would leave for her next assignment. The realization brought a sharp pang she hadn't anticipated when accepting this position. The door opened behind her, and Elijah joined her, his injured arm carried carefully against his body. "You should be resting," she admonished gently. "Couldn't sleep." He settled beside her on the bench. Too many thoughts. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes. The night sounds a soothing backdrop. "The children will miss you," he finally said. "Samuel asked if you could stay longer." "I'll miss them too." She hesitated. "And I've enjoyed our conversations." "As have I." Elijah turned to face her, his expression more open than she'd yet seen it. "Dorothy, Whatever he intended to say remained unspoken as a distant rumble of thunder interrupted the moment. Dorothy glanced at the darkening horizon. "Storm coming," she observed, rising from the bench. "I should finish packing." Elijah stood too, a flicker of something, disappointment, crossing his features. "Of course. You'll want to be ready for early departure." As they parted at her door, Dorothy found herself wishing circumstances were different, that she wasn't a traveling teacher with obligations to other families, that he wasn't still healing from his loss. "Good night, Elijah," she said softly. "Good night, Dorothy," he replied, his gaze lingering on her face before he turned away. The morning of Dorothy's departure dawned bright and clear, the night storm having passed without incident. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with Alice clinging to Dorothy's skirts and Samuel maintaining a stoic silence that reminded her painfully of his father. "Remember, you must practice your letters every day," she told them as Elijah loaded her trunk onto the wagon. "I'll be back in 6 weeks to check your progress." "Promise?" Alice asked, her lower lip trembling. "I promise." Dorothy knelt to embrace the little girl, then turned to Samuel. "And I expect a full report on those ship books I'm leaving with you." The boy nodded seriously. "I'll read every page." Saying goodbye to Mrs. Miller was easier. The housekeeper had already assured Dorothy that she would oversee the children's daily practice. But as Dorothy approached Elijah waiting by the wagon, she found words suddenly inadequate. "I've written down instructions for changing the bandages," she said, handing him a folded paper. "And there's extra salve in the—" "We'll manage," he interrupted gently. "You've done more than enough." He helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. As they set off down the long drive towards Silverton, Dorothy felt the weight of unsaid words between them. They had traveled perhaps a mile when Elijah unexpectedly spoke. "I haven't thanked you properly. For tending your wound. Any decent person would have." "No," He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "For bringing life back into my home. Before you came, we were just existing." The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. "Your children are wonderful, Elijah. You've done well by them, even in your grief. It wasn't just the children who benefited from your presence." He glanced at her briefly. "I've been half alive since Margaret passed. These past 2 weeks, I remembered what it feels like to look forward to each day." Dorothy's heart quickened at the admission. "I've enjoyed my time with your family more than I can express." 6 weeks is a long time, he said after a moment. "Not so very long," she countered softly. "And I've left plenty of assignments to keep you all occupied." A small smile touched his lips. "Samuel's already planning to build a model ship. With his father's talent for construction, I'm sure it will be magnificent." The conversation flowed more easily after that, covering the children's progress and plans for their continued education. Yet beneath the practical discussion, Dorothy sensed a deeper current, possibilities neither of them was quite ready to voice. As they approached Silverton, Elijah suddenly slowed the wagon. "Dorothy," he said, her name sounding like a question on his lips. "Would it be improper if I wrote to you? Not just about the children's education." She felt a blush warm her cheeks. "I would welcome your letters, Elijah. Very much." The relief in his expression was unmistakable. "I'm not much for fancy words, but I'd like to continue our conversations, even at a distance." "I'd like that too," she admitted. When they reached Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, Elijah helped unload Dorothy's belongings with careful efficiency. Their goodbye was necessarily brief and proper, with Mrs. Holloway looking on, but the gentle pressure of his hand as he helped her down from the wagon conveyed what words could not. 6 weeks, he reminded her quietly. "I'll be counting the days," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. As his wagon disappeared down the street, Dorothy faced Mrs. Holloway with what she hoped was a professional demeanor. "Well now," the older woman said with a knowing smile, "I do believe Elijah Foster looked a sight more alive than when he picked you up 2 weeks ago." Dorothy chose not to respond directly. "The children made excellent progress. They're very bright." Mrs. Holloway ushered her inside. "And I suppose it's purely educational interest that has you both looking like you've been separated from your right arm?" This time, Dorothy couldn't prevent the blush that heated her face. "Mr. Foster is simply concerned about his children's education." "Of course he is, dear." Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. "Now come along. The Henderson family will be here shortly to collect you, and you'll want to freshen up." As Dorothy prepared for her next assignment, she found herself already composing her first letter to Elijah in her mind. The Henderson farm proved a stark contrast to the Foster ranch. Though the family was kind enough, the cramped cabin housed 7 children, and Dorothy found herself teaching in a corner of the main room amidst the constant bustle of farm life. Her first letter arrived from Elijah after just 1 week. A simple account of ranch activities and the children's progress, but with a personal closing that warmed her heart. "The porch seems emptier without our conversations. The children send their love, as do I in my way. Yours, Elijah." Dorothy wrote back that same evening, describing her new pupils and the challenges of teaching in such close quarters. She found herself including small observations she thought might make him smile. The way the youngest Henderson child insisted on wearing her bonnet backward, the magnificent sunset over the valley. Their correspondence continued through her subsequent postings. The Mitchell mining claim, where she taught 3 children in a converted tool shed, and the Douglas Ranch, where she shared a room with the family's teenage daughters. Each letter from Elijah grew slightly longer, slightly more personal, until they were sharing thoughts and memories they had never voiced during their brief time together. In one letter, he described taking the children to a high meadow filled with wildflowers. "Alice gathered a bouquet she insisted we bring home for when you return. They're pressed between the pages of the dictionary now, waiting. As are we all." Dorothy kept every letter tied with ribbon in her traveling desk, rereading them in quiet moments. Through his words, she came to understand the depth of the man she had only begun to know during those 2 weeks at his ranch. He wrote of his childhood in Wyoming, of his dreams for the ranch, of the slow healing that came with time. He never mentioned love directly, but it infused every carefully chosen word, every shared thought. 5 weeks into her circuit, Dorothy received her most treasured letter yet. "Dear Dorothy, Samuel completed his model ship today. He insists it's bound for Boston to bring you home to us. Home. The word feels right when I think of you returning. The ranch has never felt so much like waiting as it does now. Yesterday, Alice asked if you might stay longer next time. Perhaps forever, were her exact words. I found I couldn't give her an honest answer without first asking you the question that has been on my mind these many weeks apart. I know your teaching brings you fulfillment and purpose. I would never ask you to abandon that calling. But I wonder if perhaps there might be a way to combine your path with ours. The school board has mentioned establishing a permanent school for the outlying ranches, with a teacher who would remain in one location while the children traveled to lessons. It's merely talk at this stage, but it plants a seed of possibility. I realize this letter borders on impropriety. We've known each other such a short time, and you deserve a proper courtship. But life in these mountains has taught me not to waste precious time. I find myself counting the days until your return, not just for the children's sake, but for my own heart, which seems to have remembered how to hope. With deepest regard, Elijah. Dorothy read the letter multiple times, her hands trembling slightly. The careful restraint of his words only emphasized the depth of feeling behind them. She penned her reply immediately, her usual measured script giving way to a more hurried hand. Dear Elijah, your letter has moved me more than I can adequately express. These weeks of correspondence have only confirmed what I began to feel during our brief time together, that in you, I have found someone who understands the person I truly am, not merely the role I fill. The idea of a permanent school is intriguing, certainly. But even without such an arrangement, please know that your question, though delicately phrased, has been answered in my heart already. I too have been counting the days until my return, not as a teacher visiting pupils, but as a woman coming back to where she has, unexpectedly but joyfully, found belonging. We will speak more when we meet. Until then, please tell Alice that forever is a word I find myself contemplating with increasing warmth. Yours in anticipation, Dorothy. She sealed the letter with trembling fingers, already envisioning the moment of her return to the Foster Ranch, now just 8 days away. The journey back to the Foster Ranch seemed interminable. Dorothy found herself urging the Hendersons' wagon driver to greater speed, earning a knowing smile from Mrs. Henderson. Someone's eager to see those Foster children again, the woman observed. They're exceptionally bright pupils, Dorothy replied diplomatically. And their father's not hard on the eyes either, Mrs. Henderson added with a wink. Half the widows in the county have set their caps for Elijah Foster, though none have gotten so much as a second glance. Dorothy felt a flutter of both pleasure and apprehension at this information. Mr. Foster is devoted to his children, and apparently to their teacher, from what I hear. Mrs. Henderson patted her hand. Don't look so startled, dear. News travels fast in these parts, and a man like Elijah writing regular letters to a pretty schoolteacher is bound to cause talk. As they crested the final rise before the Foster Ranch, Dorothy's heart leapt at the sight of figures waiting by the gate. Not just Elijah and the children, but what appeared to be several ranch hands and neighboring families as well. What on earth, she murmured. Mrs. Henderson smiled. I may have sent word of our expected arrival time. The wagon had barely stopped when Alice broke from the group, racing toward them with a joyful cry of Miss Campbell. Dorothy stepped down just in time to catch the little girl in her arms, laughing as Samuel approached at a more dignified pace, but with an equally bright smile. We missed you terribly, Alice declared, clinging to her neck. I missed you too, sweetheart, Dorothy replied, her eyes seeking Elijah over the child's shoulder. He stood a few paces back, his expression a mixture of joy and nervous anticipation that matched her own tumultuous feelings. When their eyes met, everything around them seemed to fade momentarily. Welcome back, Miss Campbell, he said formally, though his voice carried an intimacy that belied the proper greeting. Thank you, Mr. Foster. She set Alice down gently. I'm pleased to see everyone looking so well. Samuel tugged at her hand. Wait until you see my ship. And Papa built us a proper schoolroom. It was supposed to be a surprise, but Alice told already. Dorothy glanced questioningly at Elijah, who shrugged with a slightly embarrassed smile. The children needed more space for their lessons, he explained. It seemed a worthwhile project. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat meaningfully. Well, we should be getting on. Dorothy's trunk can stay with the Fosters, I imagine. The implication in her tone was unmistakable, and Dorothy felt a blush warming her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, Thank you for bringing me, Mrs. Henderson. As the wagon departed, Dorothy became aware of the small crowd still watching with undisguised interest. Elijah seemed to remember them at the same moment. We've prepared a little welcome, he explained. Nothing fancy, just some neighbors who wanted to discuss that school idea I mentioned. A school meeting? She asked, surprised. Among other things, he replied cryptically, offering his arm to escort her toward the house. The little welcome proved to be a proper gathering, with tables set up in the yard and Mrs. Miller presiding over a spread of food that suggested days of preparation. Dorothy found herself introduced to neighboring ranchers and their families, all of whom seemed curiously interested in her teaching philosophy and whether she might consider a permanent position in the area. The Silverton School Board representative will be here tomorrow, Elijah explained as they finally found a moment alone. There's serious talk of establishing a permanent school for the outlying ranches, using a vacant homestead about 3 miles from here. That sounds promising, she replied carefully, uncertain of his feelings on the matter. It would mean regular hours, proper facilities. He hesitated. And you could have a permanent home nearby, rather than traveling constantly. The hope in his eyes gave her courage. Elijah, about your letter, Papa. Alice interrupted, pulling at his sleeve. Mrs. Miller says it's time. He smiled apologetically at Dorothy. Apparently there's a schedule I'm meant to follow. Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you. Curious, she allowed him to guide her away from the gathering, toward a path that led behind the main house. The children skipped ahead, exchanging conspiratorial glances that suggested they were party to whatever surprise awaited. The path wound through a small copse of aspen trees before opening onto a clearing where a new structure stood, a charming, single-room building with large windows and a small covered porch. Your schoolroom? Dorothy asked, admiring the craftsmanship evident even from outside. That was the original plan, Elijah admitted. But as I built it, it became something more. He hesitated, then continued softly. It could be a schoolroom, certainly. But it could also be a home, Dorothy, for a teacher who might want to stay. The meaning behind his words was unmistakable. Dorothy's heart raced as she looked from the building to Elijah's face, finding there all the emotion his carefully restrained letters had suggested. May I see inside? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, leading her up the short steps. The interior was simply but thoughtfully furnished. A small writing desk by the window, bookshelves along one wall, a comfortable chair near the stone fireplace. But what caught Dorothy's attention was the vase of wildflowers on the desk, clearly Alice's contribution, and beside it, Samuel's completed model ship. The children helped plan it, Elijah explained, watching her reaction. They have very decided opinions about what a teacher's house should include. It's perfect, she said honestly, turning to face him. But Elijah, I need to be certain. Is this truly what you want? It hasn't been very long since. He took her hands in his expression solemn. Margaret will always be part of our lives, part of who the children are. But she would have been the first to tell me that life must go on. His eyes held her steadily. These past weeks of writing to you, of sharing thoughts I've never voiced to another soul, they've shown me that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude or loneliness. It's something new, something real. I feel it too, Dorothy admitted, her voice trembling slightly. From those evenings on the porch, listening to you talk about the stars. His smile warmed his entire face. I built this hoping you might consider staying, not just as the children's teacher, but as part of our family, in whatever capacity you're comfortable with. Are you proposing Elijah Foster? She asked, surprised by her own boldness. I'm suggesting a beginning, he replied carefully. The school board will be offering you a permanent position tomorrow. I'm offering a permanent home, and hearts that have come to care for you deeply. Mine especially. Dorothy felt tears welling in her eyes. When I came west, I was seeking purpose, a place where I could make a difference. I never expected to find a family as well. Is that a yes? Came Samuel's hopeful voice from the doorway, where he and Alice stood watching with wide eyes. Dorothy laughed through her tears. It's a definite yes to staying. As for the rest, she looked up at Elijah. I believe some things are worth taking time to do properly. The joy that spread across his face was answer enough. He lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that touched her deeply. Then we'll begin with having you as our neighbor and teacher, he said, and let the future unfold as it will. Alice could contain herself no longer. She burst forward to wrap her arms around Dorothy's waist. But you'll still come for supper every night, won't you? And read stories? And help me with my sewing? And teach me about navigation? Samuel added hopefully. Dorothy looked at their eager faces, then at Elijah's quietly happy expression. I would be honored to do all those things, she assured them. For as long as you'll have me. Forever, Alice declared with childish certainty. Just like in the stories. Elijah's eyes met Dorothy's over the children's heads, and the promise in them needed no words. As the four of them walked back toward the gathering, Dorothy felt a certainty she had never known before, that sometimes the most unexpected journeys led exactly where one was meant to be. Silverton, Colorado Territory, 1880. The schoolhouse bell rang out across the valley, its clear tones signaling the end of the day's lessons. Dorothy gathered her books as her pupils rushed to collect their slates and readers, their excited chatter filling the room that had been her domain for the past 6 months. Remember, your compositions are due tomorrow, she called above the noise. 2 full pages on the most important person in my community. As the children filed out, Dorothy moved to the window, watching as they dispersed, some to waiting horses, others to parents' wagons, a few setting off on foot toward nearby homesteads. The school that had begun as a hopeful idea had flourished, with 15 regular pupils and occasional adult classes in the evenings. The sound of a familiar wagon approaching brought a smile to her face. Right on schedule, Elijah appeared, Samuel and Alice beside him on the seat. Though they were officially her pupils, their father insisted on collecting them himself each day, a routine that had become the highlight of Dorothy's afternoons. As the wagon stopped outside, Dorothy straightened her dress and pinned a loose strand of hair back into place. 6 months of proper courtship had done nothing to diminish the flutter in her heart whenever Elijah appeared. Miss Campbell, Alice called, waving enthusiastically from the wagon. Dorothy locked the schoolhouse door and walked to meet them, accepting Elijah's hand as she climbed onto the seat beside him. His touch lingered, a small liberty they allowed themselves after months of careful propriety. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice carrying the warmth reserved only for her. "Productive." Even young Thomas managed to sit still for nearly an hour. Samuel leaned forward from his place behind them. "Did you tell them about tomorrow?" Dorothy exchanged a smile with Elijah. "Not yet. I thought we might wait until supper, when Mrs. Miller and everyone is present." The everyone included the 3 ranch hands who had become like extended family over the months, joining them regularly for the evening meal. What had once been Elijah's quiet, grief-shadowed household had transformed into a warm, lively home, a change Dorothy observed with quiet pride. As they rode toward the ranch, Alice regaled them with tales of her friend Martha's new puppy, while Samuel discussed the progress of his latest ship model. Elijah's hand occasionally brushed Dorothy's on the seat between them, each touch a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had deepened with every passing week. When they reached the ranch, Dorothy was surprised to see Mrs. Holloway's buggy parked by the barn. "We have a visitor?" she asked. Elijah nodded, a mysterious smile playing at his lips. Mrs. Holloway had some business to discuss. School board matters. Inside, they found Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Holloway deep in conversation over tea, which paused abruptly when the 4 of them entered. "There you are," Mrs. Holloway exclaimed. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your minds." Dorothy glanced questioningly at Elijah, who merely shrugged, though the twinkle in his eyes suggested he was enjoying her confusion. "Children," Mrs. Miller said, "come help me prepare supper. Your father and Miss Campbell need to speak with Mrs. Holloway." Once they were seated in the parlor, Mrs. Holloway pulled an official-looking document from her bag. "The school board has been more than pleased with your work, Miss Campbell," she began formally. "So pleased, in fact, that they've decided to offer you a permanent contract." "That's wonderful news," Dorothy replied, genuinely touched by the recognition. "There is, however, one small complication." Mrs. Holloway glanced at Elijah. "The board has a policy about married teachers." Dorothy felt heat rise to her face. "I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do, dear." Mrs. Holloway smiled broadly. "Mr. Foster here has been quite forthcoming about his intentions. The question is whether you intend to accept his proposal whenever he gets around to making it properly." Elijah cleared his throat. "I had planned something a bit more romantic than this, Mrs. Holloway." "Romance is all well and good," the older woman replied. but I need to know whether I'm offering a contract to Miss Campbell or Mrs. Foster come the fall term. Dorothy looked at Elijah, whose expression had softened into one of such tender hope that it took her breath away. I had planned to ask at sunset, he said quietly, on the ridge where we watched the stars last summer. The children helped pick the spot, Mrs. Holloway added helpfully. They've been beside themselves keeping the secret. Dorothy felt tears pricking at her eyes. And the school board? Would they truly accept a married teacher? They would for you, Mrs. Holloway confirmed. Provided, of course, that you maintain the same high standards you've established. Elijah took Dorothy's hand in his. I told you once that I was offering a beginning. These past months have been the happiest I could have imagined. The children adore you. The ranch feels whole again, and I. He paused, emotion making his voice rough. I find myself looking forward to each day in a way I thought was lost to me forever. What Mr. Foster is trying to say, Mrs. Holloway interjected with fond exasperation, is that he loves you desperately and wants to marry you before the spring planting. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway, Elijah said dryly, though his eyes never left Dorothy's face. What I'm trying to say, Dorothy Campbell, is that I love you. Will you marry me and make our family complete? The simplicity of the question, asked without grand gestures but with absolute sincerity, was perfect. Dorothy squeezed his hand, her heart too full for words for a moment. Yes, she finally managed. With all my heart, yes. From the kitchen doorway came a muffled cheer, revealing that their private conversation had had an audience all along. Alice burst into the room, unable to contain herself any longer. Does this mean you'll live with us forever now? She demanded. Dorothy laughed, opening her arms to the little girl. It does indeed. Samuel approached more cautiously, though his eyes shone with the same excitement as his sister's. Will you still be our teacher too? At school? Yes, Dorothy assured him. But at home, I'll be your mother, if you'll have me. The boy's solemn nod was followed by a fierce hug that expressed more than words could have. As the children celebrated around them, Elijah leaned close to whisper in Dorothy's ear, I had a whole speech prepared for the ridge. Save it for later, she whispered back. I want to hear every word. Mrs. Holloway departed with her answer for the school board, and the household settled into a celebratory supper, with Mrs. Miller producing a cake she had somehow prepared without Dorothy noticing. Later that evening, true to his word, Elijah took Dorothy to the ridge as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. There, with the ranch spread out below them and the endless Colorado sky above, he shared the speech he had prepared, a heartfelt declaration of love that brought fresh tears to Dorothy's eyes. As twilight gathered around them, Elijah pointed to the first star appearing in the darkening sky. When I was at my lowest, after losing Margaret, I would look at the stars and feel nothing but emptiness, he confessed. The night you and I sat here with the children, teaching them about constellations, was the first time I felt hope again. Dorothy leaned against his shoulder, her hand securely in his. I came west seeking purpose, but found so much more. A traveling teacher who found a permanent home, he said softly, drawing her closer. And a lonely rancher who found love when he least expected it, she added, turning her face up to his. Their first kiss, beneath the canopy of emerging stars, sealed a promise that had begun with letters exchanged across mountain valleys and would continue in the shared life stretching before them. A life neither had imagined when a widowed rancher met a traveling teacher on a spring morning in Silverton. As they walked back toward the house hand in hand, the lights of home guiding their way, Dorothy knew with absolute certainty that some journeys were meant to end exactly where they began, not with goodbye, but with forever.